Hello and welcome to Thursday in Parliament. Our look at the best of the day in the Commons and the Lords. On this programme, the Commons Speaker thanks the Leader of the House for a moving speech following the jailing of the man who murdered Joe Cox.
The power and beauty of those words clearly will resonate with all of us.
Peers call for better sex and relationship education in schools.
The ignorance of the menstrual cycle and basic biology is very, very striking.
And why those mass walks through the division lobbies in Parliament just have to stay.
For members of the opposition, it gives an opportunity for team building, which is extremely important.
But first, the Cabinet Minister David Lidington has made a moving plea in the Commons for the country to come together and turn its back on extremism, following the sentencing this week of the man who murdered Joe Cox. On Wednesday, Thomas Mair was found guilty at the Old Bailey of murdering the West Yorkshire Member of Parliament in June this year. Evidence gathered by the police had shown Mair to be obsessed with the Nazis and with ideas of white supremacy. Mair was sent to prison for the rest of his life for the murder.
I hope we can all agree that perhaps the best tribute that we here, whatever our party politics, can pay to Jo and her memory is to recommit ourselves, whether as constituency members or holders of various offices, to do all that lies within our power to ensure that this country remains a place where people of different ethnic origins and different faiths can live together in mutual respect, goodwill and harmony, and can celebrate together our common citizenship and our shared institutions and values and traditions. And that we will also continue unflinchingly to stand for the truth that it is through parliamentary democracy that we can seek to secure change and find a better future for those who sent us here, rather than through violence or extremism.
I thank the Leader of the House for what he has just said. The power and beauty of those words clearly will resonate with all of us.
And I'd like to thank MP4 for organising and playing in memory of Joe Cox. The members for Cardiff West, East Yorkshire, Perth and North Perthshire, and Ian Causey, who was a former member, spent a lot of time last Thursday organising the Song for Jo, which I think is coming out in January. Her love, values and example lives on in all of us. The governments are not just about fixing the roof. We are about transforming lives. Let us dedicate ourselves to that task in her memory.
Thomas Mair was heard to shout "Britain first" as he attacked Joe Cox.
Can we have a debate about whether Britain First should be prescribed as a terrorist organisation and banned from standing in democratic elections?
I can't offer an immediate debate. As the old lady probably knows, the Home Office brings forward orders for the prescription of particular organisations, but must do so on the basis of evidence. There have been cases in the past where organisations that have been so prescribed have gone to the courts and successfully won a judicial review to say that the evidence on which that action had been taken was not sufficient. So I'll make sure that her proposal is reported to my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, but there has to be clear evidence of terrorist involvement for the terrorist prescription to be applied.
David Lidington. Former military chiefs say it's time to shield British servicemen and women from what they call unfounded and spurious claims of abuse. They object to the multiple legal claims being lodged against the armed forces, claims that have arisen from conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. In a Lords debate, a former chief of the Defence Staff, Lord Richard, urged the government to opt out of human rights laws in future conflicts, while a senior lawyer warned against retreating from the UK's moral obligations.
I am proud to have served the Queen and country, and it now distresses me, as it plainly distresses lots of others, to see how today, often years after valiant service in conflicts abroad, our forces are subject to apparently endless claims and allegations of misconduct. And not only is this upsetting, it affects our nation's combat capabilities, it damages morale, recruitment, and indeed our fighting strength.
Every serviceman and woman of whatever rank should not be exposed in operations to fear of, let alone related mental trauma from, contemporary legislation, even that which has brought strength and validity to human rights protections.
A leading QC recalled the case in 2002 of Baha Musa, an Iraqi who died while in the custody of British soldiers.
The killing of Baha Musa was a terrible, terrible blot on our reputation. Here was a man with a young family, found in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was a receptionist in a hotel, and he was beaten to death, unfortunately, by British forces. Without the Human Rights Act, which forced the government to hold an inquiry, there would have been no investigation, no accountability, and no justice.
She said the UK should not retreat from its legal obligations.
Now, as a nation, we seek to uphold our values against those intent on destroying them. And if we compromise, we lose our moral standing and betray the trust of those we seek to protect. Hypocrisy doesn't win wars, and nor does it win hearts and minds.
Another former army chief was highly critical of the government.
At the heart of the issue here is the willingness of government ministers and officials to believe the fallacious allegations of Iraqis and Afghans, themselves manipulated by unscrupulous and commercially driven lawyers, rather than to have confidence in the armed forces chain of command and the tried and tested processes of investigation and judicial disposal.
We must be prepared to derogate from the European Convention on Human Rights. I applaud the government's stated intention to do this, but I'm keen to see the details of their strategy. Like other noble lords, I wish to know when and in what circumstances will it apply. Is it automatic or dependent on a parliamentary consensus that may not be forthcoming on the day? And I think clarity on this issue now is vital. Secondly, as the noble and learned Lord Brown proposes, the government should reassert the primacy of the Geneva Convention in regulating and guiding the actions of our armed forces in conflict.
What we are not suggesting is that the armed forces should somehow be freed from the constraints of the rule of law. The degree of necessity and level of acceptable risk are often difficult judgments, and sometimes those judgments will turn out in hindsight to have been wrong. If the decisions were made negligently, then those responsible for them should be called to account, and legal routes for doing so have long existed. But if every judgment is to be second-guessed in the courts, then the result will be caution and even risk aversion. History has amply demonstrated that both of these tendencies are themselves damaging and dangerous over the long run.
The Defence Minister explained the government's plan to derogate from the European Convention on Human Rights.
Let me be clear here. There is no question of a blanket opt-out from the ECHR. If and when a derogation is made, it could only be made from certain articles of the Convention, and it would have to be fully justified by the circumstances pertaining at the time. Where justified in the light of circumstances, it could serve to limit some of the types of opportunistic ECHR-based claims we have seen, and would reflect what we consider to be the right balance between these rights and the law of armed conflict.
And he said the armed forces were at all times subject to the UK law and the Geneva Convention would still apply. Back in the House of Commons, there was a call for the government to reverse cutbacks in public health provision. The demand was made in a general debate by the chair of the Health Committee, the Conservative Dr Sarah Wollaston. She reminded MPs of Theresa May's pledge to reduce the gap in life expectancy between the richest and the poorest. She said it was disappointing to see reductions in public health budgets.
When we look at what's happening in public health, we've seen from a survey by the Association of Directors of Public Health, who surveyed their members in February this year, that what this is affecting, the cuts to public health budget, is around areas like weight management, drugs, smoking cessation and alcohol. And these are all key determinants that we need to tackle. In my own area, part of which covers Torbay, cuts to council budgets for public health of around £345,000 are resulting in the decommissioning of healthy lifestyle services.
The future of substance misuse services is in jeopardy when some local authorities are facing huge cuts to public health budgets with no actual statutory obligation to provide these services. And it really is something that we need to be addressing when we're talking about health inequalities.
Premature mortality rates are 20% higher in Scotland than in England and Wales, even after deprivation is accounted for, and the premature mortality rates in Glasgow is 30% higher than in equally deprived areas like Liverpool and Manchester. The former has been dubbed the Scottish effect, the latter the Glasgow effect. Both account for approximately 5,000 extra unexplained deaths per year in Scotland. That's 5,000 people dying prematurely, dying needlessly over and above normal inequalities in health.
In the UK, between 1.3 and 2.5 million years of lives are lost as a result of health inequality in England. Many children never reach their potential throughout their lives, and one of the reasons is because of a lack of healthy relationships in their early years. Relationship breakdown is a significant driver of poverty and of health inequality, and a comprehensive cross-departmental strategy to combat health inequality must include measures to strengthen healthy relationships and to combat relationship breakdown, which is at epidemic levels in our country.
Now, dental and oral health has and continues to be the Cinderella of health service provision in this country, seen as nice to have, something to be tackled after the good ship NHS returns to calmer waters, only due to much needed extra funding once the financial black holes elsewhere in the NHS have been plugged. Such inequality in dental and oral health is plain wrong, an unspoken injustice in today's society, and tackling it cannot and should not be year after year kicked down the road like the proverbial can.
We must focus on key determinants such as obesity, smoking, suicide and alcohol. These are the core business. This is the core business of the challenge we face. And that is why we're working closely with our partners in the NHS, PHE, local government and schools to deliver the childhood obesity plan. It's been raised by many today. I would like to assure the House that delivery of this plan has started. We have consulted on the soft drinks industry levy and launched a broad sugar reduction programme. These measures will have a positive impact on lower income groups in particular who are disproportionately affected.
The debate on health inequalities. You're watching our roundup of the day in the Commons and the Lords. Still to come, should sex education be made compulsory in schools? Labour is demanding to know what the government is doing to mitigate rising food prices in the wake of the UK's decision to leave the EU. The fall in the value of the pound has made imports more expensive. At Environment Question Time, Labour said that was already having an impact on the food industry and on shoppers.
The pound has fallen, the cost of imports has risen. Brexit is costing the wine industry £413 million more in imports alone. From Marmite Gate to the Toblerone Gap, we've had the rising prices across the food industry as customers are paying more for food, while those working in farming and food production have been hit even harder, and it's getting worse. What is the Secretary of State doing to mitigate against this?
Well, the Honourable Lady will be aware that we have an incredibly thriving food and farming sector that employs 1 in 8 of us. It's worth over £100 billion each year to our economy. Our food innovation is second to none. We produce more new food products every year than France and Germany combined. Food inflation is low. It continues to be low. And we are seeing a very thriving sector improving on exports up this year. And we're doing everything we can to create a sustainable environment for the future.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reality is food is inflating at 5%. This is on her watch, her responsibility, her crisis, and people are struggling now. The call from the sector is that they need security. Security of labour, security in the market, security of trade and security in knowing the plans leaving the EU for the sector. Labour can give confidence today to the sector. We have a clear plan. So why won't the Secretary of State share her plan? Is it because there isn't one?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that was rather nonsense, if I may say so. In fact, food inflation, food prices have been dropping. They peaked in 2008, and food prices do move up and down. But the points that she's making about the resilience of the food and drink sector, it's extraordinary. Our exports this year are well up on last year. We're seeing booming growth in our food and drink sector. We're doing everything we can on food innovation, on getting young people into apprenticeships in increasingly high technology jobs. This is a very well organised sector with great potential.
Many of the agricultural workforce are seasonal workforce from other EU states who take advantage of the single market's free movement policy. Given this, can the Minister provide a guarantee to rural businesses in my constituency and beyond that these seasonal workers who come to Scotland for produce picking, food and fish processing will still be able to work here after the UK has left the EU?
Well, my right honourable and honourable friends are very aware of the issues. It's not an issue unique to her constituency, and she will recognise that this will be part of the ongoing discussions within our government and, of course, with the EU.
Philip Hollowbone.
Great British breakfast cereal Weetabix is made in Burton Latimer in the Kettering constituency, and the wheat for the Weetabix is grown on farms within a 50-mile radius. What proportion of the nation's food do we grow ourselves, and what proportion would the Minister like to see us grow ourselves?
Well, the honourable gentleman will be aware that of the food that we can produce in this country, we produce around 74% of the food that we consume. If you include foods that we're unable to grow here, clearly the percentage is slightly lower. But look, we've got a commitment to have a vibrant, profitable farming industry. We want to grow more, we want to sell more, and we want to import less. And if we achieve all of that, obviously we'll see our self-sufficiency improve over time.
Food and drink production has flourished under my right honourable friend's leadership. As we've just heard, record levels of hard cheese and sour grapes are emanating from that side of the chamber. And in my own constituency, the Hog's Back Brewery, a very successful microbrewery, is doing a roaring trade. Could I invite my right honourable friend to join me for a knees-up in my brewery, something the other side of the House could never organise?
Yes, absolutely, be delighted to do that. I think some of the amazing products, taking gin out to the Chinese, for example, was a great experience. Looking at the beers that the Vietnamese are drinking from the United Kingdom already, looking at market access, greater exports, seeing just yesterday a taste of Cheltenham beers. And my right honourable friend is right to raise his own constituents' produce, and I'd be delighted to share a knees up with him anytime.
Andrea Ledson with the promise of a good night out. The issue of whether sex and relationship education should be taught as a compulsory subject in secondary schools in England continues to cause controversy. Last year, the then Education Secretary, Nicky Morgan, turned down the call of 4 Commons committees for the subject to be given statutory status. A Labour peer put down a question asking if a minister planned to make it part of the national curriculum. She said in the 3 years up to 2015, 5,500 sexual offences were reported to the police by UK schools. And that was probably just the tip of the iceberg.
With many boys learning about sex from online pornography, and some schools failing in their legal obligation to keep girls safe, does the Noble Lord the Minister agree with me there has to be a whole school approach on a statutory basis with Ofsted including this subject in its inspections?
Well, I agree entirely with the Noble Lady that it's completely unacceptable for pupils to learn about sex from pornography rather than from a age-appropriate programme of SOE in schools, and the whole school approach is appropriate, and of course Ofsted do have a vital role to play. They take an interest in all school provision, particularly how schools are providing the spiritual, moral, social and cultural development for their pupils.
He may be aware that, of course, in Scotland, sex and relationship education is part of the curriculum, and every young person receives that entitlement, and indeed there is a syllabus from Key Stage 2 right through. Perhaps in his active review he might look at lessons that can be learnt from Scotland.
What is absolutely shocking is the very few number of girls who even know when ovulation occurs. The ignorance of the menstrual cycle and basic biology is very, very striking. And isn't this not another example of the narrowness of the curriculum in school, which actually prevents a wider education generally, and which is very important in these matters?
Well, I'm fully aware of the programme that the Noble Lord refers to at Imperial College, and I know it's a very valued one by schools that participate in it. I am a bit shocked to hear what he said. Of course, these matters should be taught in science. But clearly this is something that is unacceptable and we need to look at further.
My Lord,
agree that it is important for such education not just to be about sex and sexuality, but sex and relationships. And should such education therefore include wholesome friendships and relationships between the sexes, the importance, as we have already discussed, of guarding against abuse, and the vital need for young people to have a healthy self-identity. And on the last point, I commend the work of the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Gloucester, on her work on body image amongst children.
The last time Noble Lords had the opportunity to consider this question was in February of this year, a question from my noble friend Baroness Massey, and on that occasion the Minister replied, and I quote, "We have asked leading head teachers and practitioners to produce an action plan for improving PSHE. We shall continue to keep the status of the subject under review and work with those experts to identify further steps that we can take to ensure, my emphasis, that all pupils receive high-quality, age-appropriate PSHE and sex and relationships education." My Lords, the Minister who gave that reply has since moved on. Indeed, she's now Leader of your Lordship's House. But the question of PSHE has not moved on. Can the Noble Lord say, firstly, what happened to the action plan? And secondly, can he say how he plans to ensure that all schools inform their pupils of the crucial issues involved in this subject so that they're adequately prepared for adult life?
Well, I think what I've said and what I can say to the Noble Lord is I think our thinking has moved on somewhat further, which I think may please some of the noble peers present today. And I hope that we'll be able to say more about this shortly.
Lord Nash. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. The famous phrase used by the Common Speaker whenever a vote in the chamber is decided. But do we need quite so much tradition when MPs take part in votes? At Westminster, the politicians use the time-honoured method of walking through what are called the division lobbies. It means a Commons vote can take a full 15 minutes. Other parliaments use quicker, more modern systems such as electronic voting, definitely a shorter process. An SNP MP said continuing to troop through division lobbies wasn't terribly sensible.
During the Higher Education Bill report stage on Monday, we spent nearly an hour trooping through the division lobbies. Has the Commission ever made a calculation of the cost to the taxpayer of that dead time in terms of staff, security and utilities? And if we are to be decanted as part of a restoration process, surely that presents an opportunity to at the very least pilot electronic voting, and we're not going to replicate every last detail of where we are just now.
I thank him for those two questions. I think just in terms of the time that it takes for members to vote, he may not be aware that I think back in 1997 this House did consider substantial changes to the way we voted, and I'm afraid the House voted to keep things exactly as they were. In relation to the restoration and renewal issue, I do hope that by perhaps early next year in this place we will have a substantive debate on it, and I think that would be the opportunity for him to raise that particular point.
Sir Desmond Sway.
Does he agree that the current system affords members an opportunity to noble ministers when they are bereft of their heavies and spin doctors?
Indeed, it is true that when trooping through the division lobbies, there are opportunities to lobby ministers, but clearly those opportunities, are more frequent for members of government than they are for members of the opposition.
Good man.
Does he not agree, though, that for members of the opposition it gives an opportunity for team building, which is extremely important? Will he do everything he can to keep this at the bottom of his interest?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention, and of course it gives me the opportunity to underline how important, particularly for her party, the opportunities for team building in the lobby must be.
Tom Brake, and that's it for now. But do join me for the week in Parliament when we take a look at a move to try to stop election fraud, and we also take a reflective discussion on how the Chancellor Philip Hammond performed in the Commons this week. But for now, from me, Keith McDougall, goodbye.